Greetings and thanks for joining me to look at Portal Entity Permissions Demystified. This is actually an extended version of a presentation that I've given a couple times before, most recently at Community Summit 2020. Due to technical problems, it got cut off, so I promised everyone to post an extended version of that presentation. But this is also for anyone who is interested in how security works on the portal and are looking at a little bit more detail on entity permissions specifically. And I'm also going to try and include some of the common gotchas, some of the common things to look out for as far as portal entity permissions are concerned. So let's dive in. Before we go any further, I'm just going to very briefly introduce the scenario that we're going to be using to demonstrate entity permissions in this video. And that scenario is service cases. So I tried to land on something that's fairly close to several real-life scenarios. It's a realistic scenario, but without necessarily relying on anything that's kind of out of the box in, say, Dynamics 365. So in Dynamics 365, you have a couple scenarios like field service, you have customer service where you're dealing with cases. This is akin to that, but maybe a little bit different. The example is drawn from inspiration from 311, which is the concept of a municipality needing to provide a 311 service to its constituents so that people can phone in and report service cases, or in other words, make service requests to the city for things like pothole repair, street light repair, park bench repair, report a water main break, or whatever the case may be. Now, in many municipalities, all of these services are kind of provided kind of directly by the city. But you may have the case where different organizations within the city operate independently. So they're not part of the same organization and they don't necessarily all have access to the back-end Power App system. So the people who are actually fixing those potholes and fixing those park benches, in other words, don't have access to the, say, field service application or anything along those lines because they don't, they're not part of that organization. Another example might be where you have a public-private partnership and various private organizations or maybe government-subsidized organizations may be responsible for actually fulfilling those service cases. But again, they're not part of the main organization that actually owns the 311 backend system, which would be our model-driven app or Dynamics 365. So in order to actually manage the service cases that are being assigned to them, in my experience, we've actually, I've actually been a part of many projects where, scenarios like this are implemented. So this is very familiar territory for me. This often, requires integrations with, back-end work order management systems across these different groups. So in other words, a service case or a service request gets created, oftentimes via a portal, which we're not going to get into the portal side of 311 in this video. But the Velocity 365 product is a product that handles that scenario. So if you're looking for that kind of solution, that's one thing to possibly investigate. But once a service request gets created, you then have to send it off to some other back-end system via an integration. Well, an alternative to that would be for all these different partners, not because they're essentially partners, to deal with their service cases via a portal. So in other words, the organizations that are actually responsible for solving the service cases, for actually fulfilling the service requests, are using the portal to receive their service cases and to fulfill those service cases, to update them when they've been completed. So that's the scenario that we're looking at here. And it's a good demonstration for entity permissions because it lets us look at different roles. You might be logging in as just a service worker who's going to be fixing the pothole and needing to report that it's finished, all the way up to partner kind of manager who can manage all the different service cases that have been assigned to that partner organization. And then in between that, you have service managers who may be in charge of a specific zone or a specific geographical service area. So service cases that are being assigned to them, they then delegate down to service workers. So it lets us demonstrate that different levels of permissions are needed and how we would leverage entity permissions to fulfill those requirements. So how is portal functionality secured? Well, portal functionality can be divided into two categories: content and query data. So content is things like web pages and other out-of-the-box portal-specific things. We're talking blogs, forums, ideas, so on and so forth. Anything that kind of comes out of the box with portals and dates way back to the original ADX Studio portals. That's kind of a pre-Power Apps type thing. The basic gist of it is anything that is portal content is going to be secured when it comes to the actual URL in the sitemap. And I'm not going to get too much into how the sitemap works or how to secure things like web pages, but that's essentially how you secure portal content. Portal content would also include things like content snippets, but those are not secured. You can't really secure content snippets in that same way. So the only content on the portal that really you can secure is content that has URLs associated to it. And the most basic example of that is web pages. So there may be another video that I'll post at some point on how to secure web pages. Certainly there's plenty of articles and documentation on how that works out there, so you can go and check that up in the interim. Query data, on the other hand, is essentially any kind of data that's being surfaced on the portal via entity forms, entity lists, web forms, or custom code, custom liquid templating that's being used to use fetch XML to query for a set of CDS records and then display them on the portal. So anything else that isn't sort of out of the box portal content would be primarily surfaced through those means and would be secured as query data. So portal content, that is the web pages and other out of the box portal functionality that has URLs associated to it, that's secured with portal specific permissions that are tied to web roles, such as web page access control rules. So if you want to secure a web page, you use a web page access control rule to do so. Everything else, i.e. the query data, is secured via entity permissions. And entity permissions is going to be our focus for today. That's what we're talking about in this video. So just to recap, access control rules, like web page access control rules, those are used to secure URLs, i.e. portal content. Entity permissions, the topic of this video, they're primarily used to secure forms and lists, as well as custom renderings that you put on your portal using liquid templates, i.e. query data. So as an example here, I'm on just a regular portal. This happens to be the D365 community portal that I've set up, but really it could have been a custom portal. And I'm going to be using this portal for the examples in this video. I haven't gone to the trouble of fully styling and adding content to make the portal look like a believable scenario. It's just here to demonstrate the concepts. So the home page looks like a regular community portal, but the scenario that we'll be looking at in this video to demonstrate entity permissions is more centered around service cases, which is sort of a bit of a field service like scenario or a 311 type of scenario, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So here you can see that I'm looking at the website, and all I have access to at this moment is just blogs and forums. But if I go and I sign in now, I'm going to sign in just as a regular user. So I'm going to sign in as John Doe. And when I go to sign in, you'll see that now I have access to a couple more pages, service cases and case list. So the URLs for these pages, service cases and case list, these URLs are protected by access permissions, web page access permissions. So the web page access permissions determine whether or not I can see those web pages on the navigation and whether or not I can actually navigate to those web pages. Once I land on that web page, you'll see that the web page essentially consists of a list of service cases, and we'll talk about service cases obviously later in this video. But this list of service cases and all the details here, the records that I'm able to access here, those are secured with entity permissions. So entity permissions are going to determine the records that I can access whenever I'm looking at lists or forms or anything like that. Or as is the case in the case list page here, this was a custom liquid templating that I used to query the system for some cases and show the cases here, just as another example. So the actual pages, the URL in the browser, that's going to be secured with access permissions, whereas the actual records that appear in the lists, in the views, are going to be filtered by entity permissions. So let's talk about web roles. Both access permissions and entity permissions are tied to web roles. At the end of the day, web roles are what essentially control the permissions that a given user is going to have. Portal users are tied to contacts in both Power Apps and D365. So if you're going to authenticate on the portal as opposed to browse anonymously as a guest, you are going to have a contact record in the system that's associated to you. Okay, so John Doe, who I logged in as just a moment ago, he has a contact record in the system, and so does every other example user account that I'm going to be logging in with in this video. So those contact records in turn may have any number of web roles associated to them. And the permissions that those users are going to have is essentially the union, the combined cumulative total of all the permissions for all the web roles that are assigned to them. So in other words, web roles never really take away access. They never take away your privileges. They only add them. So the more web roles that a user has, the more access they're going to have. Access control rules lock down content when they are created. So if you're familiar with securing web pages and portal content, you may be aware of the fact that when you create access control rules, previously open content, because all portal content is essentially accessible to the world by default. In other words, there's no URLs that are restricted by default. The only way to restrict URLs is to create access control rules, right? So once those access control rules get created, then the content is secured, and only the web roles that are related to the access control rules that you just created are going to have access to that content. So when you create a restrict read rule, what you're saying is, I am now restricting this page only to this web role or these web roles. So that's a little bit counterintuitive. A lot of people have struggled with that one. But fortunately, when it comes to CDS query data and entity permissions, it's a lot more straightforward. By default, you have access to nothing. So if you enable entity permissions on forms and lists, and we'll talk about what that means to enable it, it is possible to not enable it, but you always should. The assumption is that you're not going to have access to anything without entity permissions being created. And once you create the entity permissions, you're granting access to records that you'd otherwise not have access to. So we can talk about a few example web roles, but before we do that, maybe I'll mention a couple of web roles that come out of the box. So there's two web roles in particular that are worth calling out. They're the anonymous portal user and the authenticated portal user web roles. These are out of the box web roles, although they can be renamed, they can be recreated, in fact, because it's an attribute on the web role itself that determines whether a web role functions as one of these two. But out of the box, they sort of come pre-created for you. And these two web roles determine the level of access for all browsing guests, that is portal users that are not logged in. So when you first land on a portal, before you log in, what level of privileges do you have? That's going to be determined by the anonymous portal web role. So any portal user that is browsing anonymously is considered to be in that web role and has the privileges that are assigned to that web role. And then there's the authenticated portal user web role, and that determines obviously the level of privilege that all authenticated users get by default prior to any other web roles being assigned to them. When you first sign in, when you first register, I should say, on the portal as a new user, right? You go in, you type in, you pick a username and password, you click register. Unless there's any automated workflows or anything along those lines that are going to explicitly assign web roles to you, you're just going to be in the authenticated portal user web role initially. Now, obviously, additional web roles can be assigned to contacts either manually or automatically via flows or other processes, but everybody who's signed in gets access to the authenticated portal user web roles privileges. Another out-of-the-box web role would be the portal administrator role, and this role is meant to be the role that's used by anyone who's going to be doing front-side editing. I've got already other blog posts, and I'll probably be posting videos at some point on the front-side editing. Because it's key to customizing the portal. Not really the topic of this video, but front-side editing privileges are also determined by access control rules, and the portal administrator essentially has grant change to the home page, so they're able to edit essentially the entire site from the front side. What I typically do is I also give the portal administrator web role as many privileges, as many entity permissions as I can for testing purposes, although you don't necessarily need to do that. Then there's some other example web roles that we're going to be using in this scenario for this video as well, like service worker, service manager, a couple of others, and we'll talk about those more specific roles when we get into the scenario, right? But if you want to be assigning different entity permissions or different levels of access to different resources who are kind of external to your organization, but still need to have different levels of access, that's where you would use different web roles that would be custom built for your scenario. Another custom-built web role that's centered around access permissions instead of entity permissions would be like a content author, somebody who has limited permissions to create perhaps web pages or blog posts or something along those lines, but doesn't necessarily have full front-side editing permissions in the way that portal administrator does. So just to dive in a little bit into what web roles look like, and how they work in relation to contacts. I've gone into the portal management app here, and just to remember that the portal management app is a model-driven app for D365 and Power Apps that lets you manage kind of all the different pieces of your portal, all of the metadata and all the configuration data that needs to be set up for the portal. So this includes things like web roles and access control rules, as well as entity permissions. So here I am looking at a contact record, and you'll notice that the form I'm using is the portal contact form, as opposed to the default contact form that comes out of the box with D365 and Power Apps. The portal contact form comes with the portal management application. Now, if I click on the web authentication tab, that's going to show me several different facets of information when it comes to the authentication piece of the portal. So their username, whether or not the login is enabled, so on and so forth. In terms of permissions, we can click to web roles. And by clicking web roles, we can see all the different web roles that have been assigned to this contact. So this is the John Doe contact that I was logging in with earlier. And you'll notice that John Doe has the service worker web role associated. If I actually go back to my list of contacts, you'll see that there's a contact that I have here named System Administrator. And if I click on System Administrator and I go to web roles, you'll see that they have the Administrator's web role. So when you want to actually go into a web role, for instance, we could take the Administrator's web role, right? You'll notice that it's essentially a name, and then you can also flag it as being the default authenticated users role or the anonymous users role that we discussed earlier. But it's really here on the related tab that you can see where the permissions are actually related to this web role. So we have things like the web page access control rules. When it comes to the system administrator, you'll notice that the system administrator has grant change to the home page, right? So we can see that the right is grant change, web page is home page, and that's going to essentially let them have front side editing permissions for the entire website. And then we have entity permissions, and entity permissions again grant access to CDS records, CDS query data that have been surfaced via entity forms, entity lists, and liquid code. So the administrator has been given global access to all of the key entities that we're using in our example scenario for this video, including service cases, service areas, contacts, and subjects. So now let's talk a little bit about entity permissions specifically. Entity permissions are records in the portal management app that allow you to specify privileges for any entity that exists within your CDS database that you want to surface on the portal via things like entity forms, entity lists, or custom liquid code. You define these entity permissions for web roles. So in other words, any web role that you're going to assign to a portal contact, a portal user, can have any number of entity permissions assigned to it. And it's going to get the sort of combined rights that all those different privileges assign to that role. Now, each permission has a scope, and that scope is going to determine whether the permission is global. In other words, it applies to kind of all records that exist in the system, or whether you are scoping the privilege only to specific rows. In other words, only to specific records. So if you're doing record level access, you assign a scope other than global. And the actual privileges themselves are granted granularly based on the CRUD operation that you're referring to: create, write, read, delete. Now in terms of where these permissions are going to be largely used, they're primarily used around entity forms and lists. So entity forms are a mechanism in the portal that allow you to create a form for your portal users to interact with your back-end database in some way, whether that is creating new records or editing existing records that exist in the database. So in other words, anytime that you need a portal user to be able to submit information on the portal, then you'd be using something along the lines of an entity form. Entity forms could also be read-only if you want to display a read-only view of a record as well. So the actions that can be performed via these entity forms are determined by those entity permissions. The other way is entity lists, and they display tabular data or lists of records from CDS. usually in a grid if you're using the sort of default out of the box display mechanism for them. So if you wanted to show a list of records on the portal, that's when you'd be using an entity list, and the records that you have access to are going to be determined by your entity permissions. So in other words, the entity list is filtered by the permissions of the portal user who is browsing that data. So let's take a quick look at the aforementioned entity permissions and entity forms and lists, those components that are going to allow us to enable the scenario that we mentioned earlier. So if we go into a web role like Service Manager, for example, and we go to Related, that's going to let us see the entity permissions that are related to this web role. So we can see that there's a variety of different entity permissions here. You can see a lot of the details of those entity permissions right on the grid. But let's go into one of the examples here. I'm going to pick the simplest one that's on the screen here, which is global access to subjects. So in other words, if you're a service manager, you should be able to know what all the different subjects that are set up in the system are. So you can see by looking at an entity permission, essentially you give the entity permission a name, and that's just a descriptive name to help you identify that record in the system. You've got the name of the entity that you are securing, the website for which the entity permission applies to, and the scope. And we're going to talk a lot more about the scope very, very shortly. That's one of the big topics for this video is understanding that scope and how it works. And then finally you've got the privileges, and the privileges are where you determine the actual actions that you can take. So you can see that if you're in the service manager role, you should be able to read what all the different subjects are, but you can't necessarily create or write any subjects. So there's no mechanism for creating new subjects or writing existing subjects. Now, of course, if I don't expose an entity form or an entity list on the portal, most users aren't going to have means by which to do that anyway. But best practice is to only grant the privileges that you know you are going to need on the portal, and not to grant any kind of higher level of access than what you realistically want those users doing. So you wouldn't just give write and create and delete to an entity unless you thought that the users may be doing that on the portal. In our scenario, you're going to be assigning subjects to service cases and viewing what the subjects on service cases are, and so that's the reason why the entity permission is set up this way. Now, in terms of how these entity permissions are leveraged, I've been mentioning entity forms and lists a lot. So let's take a look at those pieces. So again, I'm in the portal management app, and under content, you can see, among other things, entity forms and lists. So if we click into entity forms, you can see that I've set up a few different forms on the portal. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about entity forms and lists. Lord knows that that's a whole series of blog posts or videos in and of itself. There's so many things to talk about when it comes to entity forms and all the different options on them. But for instance, I've just got a service case edit form, okay, and I can click on that form, and just a brief rundown. You're specifying the entity name that you're surfacing on the portal. The form that you're going to surface on the portal, because it needs to have an actual form associated to it. So which form am I exposing? Whether it's the mode, edit, create, read only, and then the website. And the big thing, there's a ton of other settings in these other tabs, but the big thing I wanted to point out here is that I've got this enable entity permissions checked. That's really key, and you always want to check that. The only reason, in fact, that is an option at all is because early on, when we were first creating entity forms, this is back at ADX Studio. I was actually part of the product team that helped build a lot of this functionality, including entity permissions. Back when we were building this, entity permissions, the topic of this video, actually came along after we'd already created entity forms and entity lists. And so in order to maintain backwards compatibility with entity forms and lists that had already been placed on the out-of-the-box portals like Community Portal, that did not leverage entity permissions, we needed to have this optional. Now, as for why the default is not to check this, that I have no idea. I'm baffled that is, Microsoft has not made that the default. It should be checked by default. And if you're going to make any customizations to your portal management app, and actually I plan to do a blog post at some point on just all the different ways that the portal management app can be customized to improve the user experience, having this default to true is quite up there, because you never want to not enable this. You always want to enable entity permissions. And if you don't enable entity permissions, in fact, not only does your permission structure break down, but a lot of the more advanced functionality of entity forms is not enabled. You're basically going back to a version of entity forms from 5-6 years ago. Any functionality that was introduced to entity forms after entity permissions were created will not function unless you tick this. The same applies to entity lists. Okay, so you can see that I have only one entity list in my example portal. And with entity list, right, again, you give it a name, you choose the name of the entity, and then you choose the view or views that you want to surface via our entity list on the portal. Pretty straightforward, although there's a lot of other options that we're not going to get into. But if you scroll down a little bit, and it's unfortunate that you need to scroll down, again, you've got this enable entity permissions. Again, you will always want to check. It doesn't check it by default. So one of the first steps that you always want to do whenever you're creating a new entity list is to check this enable entity permissions. So with that out of the way, we can start looking into the specifics of our scenario and start talking about scope. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is scope, and the scope of an entity permission is kind of one of the most important aspects of that entity permission, other than the web role that it's associated to and the privileges that you're assigning themselves. You need to understand to which records in the system you're effectively granting access to by assigning that permission with that scope to that web role. Now, the simplest scope is global scope. So when you create an entity permission with global scope, what you're doing is effectively giving the web role that's assigned to your portal contact access to all records of that type of entity that are in the system. So in other words, you're giving access effectively to the entire table of the database. This is obviously the simplest type of scope to understand, and the example is the simplest. So let's take a look at what this looks like on the portal. So for global scope, the simplest example would just be to look at the system administrator role. Now, the system administrator role for my scenario is equipped with pretty much full permissions to see everything on the portal. And the reason for that is because I just think that it makes sense that if you are, the system administrator of the portal and you have front-side editing permissions, that you have, full access to all of the different entities in the system for testing purposes. This may not be applicable to your specific scenario where you might have the portal administrator who has front-side editing but nonetheless can't access various types of information that may be sensitive. But this is what I've done. Now, by default, the system administrator web role does not have global access to everything because with entity permissions, you need to explicitly assign them, and that applies to the administrator web role as well. So you can see that I've explicitly granted global access to all the different entities that I'm using in the scenario. So I have global access to service cases, to contacts, service areas, and subjects. And I can demonstrate this by looking at the portal. So here on the portal, I'm going to sign in as administrator. And once I'm signed in as administrator, I'll be able to go to service cases and show that I have access to all the different service cases in the system, regardless of who they are assigned to or any other factors like that. So if I go to service cases, you'll see that I have access to all the service cases that I've created, regardless of whether their service provider is Contoso Hydro, so in other words, they're some sort of water service case, or if they're an electric issue, or who the responsible contact is or what service area is in, it does not matter. I have full access. I also have the ability to create new service cases here as well, and that's because I also granted create permission in addition to read and write permission to system administrator as well. So again, if I, those are granular rights, so I could give the system administrator full read privileges, but not write or create. That would be a valid scenario as well. Here what I've done is I've given full read, write, create, delete for everything in the system. So next up is contact scope. Now contact scope is kind of the next level up in terms of complexity, and it's the first scope that lets you essentially add row level permissions to the portal. In other words, we're going to restrict access for a given logged in portal user to only specific records. Now, when it comes to the portal, the only way to have record level access assigned is for some sort of a relationship to exist from the contact that represents that portal user, the portal contact, to the record in question. A relationship has to be there. And the simplest way is for it to be a direct relationship. In other words, you have a contact, and then you have a one-to-n or an n-to-one relationship to, some table in the database, some other record from that contact, right? So service cases that are assigned to a service worker, for instance, or there could be many, many other examples. So that is the example that we're looking at today. It requires only that you assign a web role with the entity permission and a scope of contact, and then that is connected to the portal contact, and then records are associated to that portal contact, and they're going to have access to those on the portal. So once again, we're going to look at our John Doe contact. Now our John Doe contact is a service worker, and he works for Contoso Hydro, which is a partner that it might be a private company, or it might be some sort of government subsidiary or something along those lines, but it's another organization separate from our organization, and it is servicing essentially water, say for a municipality. And his primary service area that he services is the South Hydro region. So we've got a municipality that is divided into regions as far as Contoso Hydro is concerned. So he's a service worker. And what that means is that he is going to be able to access all the service cases that have been assigned to him. So let's take a look at the service worker web role. If we look at related, we can go to entity permissions, and you can see that we have a permission here called service cases, and it's scoped to contact. Okay, so once again, we have the name of the entity just as we did before, the relationship by which the John Doe is related to the service cases, and we have the permissions. So we're able to read service cases, we're able to write them, and we're able to append and append to. So in other words, if we need to assign a subject to the case or create tasks under the case or something like that. And most importantly, the scope. It's scoped contact. So that means that John Doe is going to be able to access cases that have specifically been assigned to him. He's not going to be able to access all the cases for Contoso Hydro, and he's not going to be able to access cases that have been assigned to any other organization or any other contact. Only those service cases that have been assigned to him. If we look at his contact record, going back here, okay, we can actually go to related and we can find related service cases. Okay, so we can see that a few service cases have been assigned to him, and we would expect that those are the service cases that he has access to. So as you can see, here I am on the portal, and I am logged in as John Doe. And as John Doe, I can go to service cases to see the service cases that I have access to. And we can see that I have access to those 4 service cases that we showed in the system before. So I have access to those service cases, and as you can see, they are all assigned to me. Now, additionally to that, if you'll remember the privileges that I have read and I also have write. So I also have the ability to edit the cases. So if I click edit here, you can see that I have a form that pops up that lets me hypothetically edit details of this case. You can see that I can actually rename it. Now, I actually didn't fully flesh out the entire end-to-end scenario, so there's no mechanism that I'm surfacing here to resolve the case or do anything like that. But what I do have the ability to do is to create tasks for the case. So I can go ahead and create tasks here, and I'll talk a little bit more about the privileges surrounding that a little bit later, right? But I click create and a form pops up, and I can create a task around that, and you can see that I can see existing tasks. But that essentially is what that would look like. If I had a contact scoped permissions, I can access service cases that have been assigned to me. You can see that I don't have the ability to assign them to other contacts or other service areas. Like if I go to change the service area, you'll see that I don't have permissions to do so, but I have the ability essentially to service the cases that have been assigned to me. So moving beyond contact scope, we have parental scope. And essentially this is how you extend that concept of records being related to the portal contact record in the system in order to grant row-level access further than just contact scope. Because if we need to grant permissions to records in CDS to a portal contact that is not directly related to them, then at the very least they need to be indirectly related to those records in some way. So with parental scope, you are essentially granting access to a certain set of records by virtue of already having access to some other set of records. In order to set this up, essentially what you have is you have your portal contact, and then you have your web role and an entity permission that's of some other scope. So it could be global scope, it could be contact scope, it could even be another parental scope, because you can have a hierarchy of different permissions that cascade, but you have some other entity permission. And so that other entity permission grants access to a certain set of records. For example, we just looked at the fact that you have your John Doe service worker contact, and he had access to related service cases. And what if we wanted to grant access to tasks that are related to those service cases? Well, first we assign permission to the cases, and then as a child, and literally it's going to be a child record of the entity permission, we have a child entity permission that's set up separately in the system. And that child entity permission then defines the rights and privileges to records that are associated to other records to which the contact has access to. So this diagram kind of demonstrates the set of records that need to exist in the system, right? You have your actual records that you're trying to grant access to, you have your contact, and then you have your two permissions records. But it's a lot easier to understand with an example. So let's move on to an example now. So here we have a different web role called Service Manager, and we have a contact actually So here we have a contact, Jane Doe, and Jane Doe is a service manager for Contoso Hydro. So she is responsible not only for perhaps directly servicing some cases, but more so for assigning and distributing service cases to other service workers within her service area. Okay, so she has a service area that she's essentially responsible for. And if we look at the web roles, and we look at the Service Manager web role, we look at Related to see the entity permissions, you'll see that like John Doe, she actually has access to service cases assigned directly to her. So very similar to the service worker role. But in addition to that, she has access to service areas. So she has access to her service area. Okay, so again, we can click into this and we can see that it defines the relationship from the contact to the service area as that primary service area lookup that we saw in the contact form earlier. And then she's going to have full access to that. Okay. Then you can also see that there's a child entity permission here as well. And if we click into that child entity permission, you can see that this entity permission defines access to service cases for my service area, meaning that she's going to be able to access service cases that are in her service area regardless of whether they're directly assigned to her or not. And you can see that the scope is parent, right? So we had that other entity permission record in the system that defined her access to service area, and now we have a child entity permission record in the system that is of scope parent, and it defines access to service cases that are related to that service area. And you'll see that in this case, we've changed the privileges a little bit. So we've made it so that she can append and append to, so she can assign those cases, but she can't service cases that are not assigned to her. Only the ones that have been directly assigned to her can she actually resolve those cases or make any other changes to those cases. And of course, we've also given her the ability to create service cases as well, in case that's a valid scenario. So we can look on the portal to see what this looks like. So here we are on the portal, and as you can see, I'm logged in as Jane Doe. I went ahead and I logged in as Jane Doe, and I have access, looking at the service cases list, to all the service cases for the South Hydro region, right? So you can see that it doesn't matter whether they're assigned to John Doe, whether they're assigned to Jane Doe, or whether they're not assigned to anyone. I have access to those cases. So cases come in, and then, you know, Jane Doe or another service manager would be logged in, and then they would be assigning cases to other contacts who are also part of their service region. So for example, I could click in and then I could go to responsible contact, and then I would have the ability to access contacts who work for Contoso Hydro, right? So you can see that this list is also being filtered by Contoso Hydro, and that's because, and if we go back to the system, you'd see that I'm filtering contacts also by the service provider. So I have the ability to assign them to other contacts who also work for Contoso Hydro. Now, you'll recall that I also gave access to service cases that are directly assigned to Jane Doe. So you can see here that we have an example of a service case for a different service provider. Now, whether or not this is a valid scenario, probably this shouldn't be assigned to Jane Doe. So I guess it's demonstrative of a mistake possibly, but there could be possibly some reason. Maybe Jane Doe, you know, pulls double duty and she works for two different, you know, sub-organizations or something like that, and is pulling double duty. But whatever the actual scenario is, you can see that although Jane Doe is the service manager for the South Hydro region, she has access to this particular service case because of the fact that it's assigned directly to her. Furthermore, you'll remember that we gave different set of privileges for service cases that are assigned directly to her versus those that are not. And you know, so when I clicked into the service case that is assigned directly to her, you see that she has edit permissions. And just to demonstrate the fact that the permissions may not be the same depending on whether the record is related or not, yeah, I've got this service case that's assigned to John Doe rather than her, and you'll see that in fact it's read-only. She doesn't have the ability to edit this case because we didn't grant that privilege. Now, going back to the Portal Management app, I want to dig even deeper here. you can see that we're again looking at the access service cases for my service area entity permission, and you can see that it has a child entity permission, right? So going back to that diagram that we showed earlier, you might have a parental entity permission that's one level deep, right? So access my service area and then access service cases that are related to that service area that I have access to. Well, you can go as many levels deep as you want, essentially, although there are some limitations that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But you can see that this parent scope entity permission, in fact, has its own child entity permission, and if we click in, it grants access to tasks. So if I have access to a service case, you've got access to tasks that are related to that service case, including the ability to create new tasks. Now this essentially means that the parent scope, really what it is its hierarchical scope. And in fact, I don't really like the parent labeling. I mean, it is parental scope, but when you see scope parent, it kind of implies that the record you're looking at is the parent, right? But hopefully I've demonstrated the fact that no, in fact, when you set the scope to parent, what you're essentially saying is that this entity permission record is the child permission of its parent, right? So you can see scope is parent, and then the actual parent entity permission is the parent of this entity permission. So I wouldn't mind it if the scope was relabeled parental or child or hierarchical, but parent is a little bit misleading, but hopefully this has helped to clarify that. So back on the portal, let's take a look at a service case for which we can go ahead and create or view tasks for the service case. So you can see that we can go ahead and create tasks for service cases that we have access to, and that's because of the parental, again, it's 3 levels down, 3-level hierarchy permission that gives us access to tasks. So the last scope that we'll look at is the account scope. And this is essentially a kind of shortcut method to set up a particular type of parental scope. Anything that you can do with account scope, you can do with parental scope. Essentially, it's just there to make the implementation of one very specific scenario just a little bit quicker and easier. It's for convenience, really. But it's not technically necessary. The account scope doesn't achieve anything that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise with parental permissions. What the account scope does is it allows you to grant a certain level of access to records that are associated to the currently logged in portal user's parent account. So assuming that you're a portal user, you've got a portal contact in the system, and there is an account that is associated to that contact, and then that account in turn is associated to other types of records, you can define access to those records with a single entity permission instead of requiring 2 separate entity permission records, one of them being a contact scope and the other one being parent scope permission, by making use of the account scope permission. So for an example of account scope, we have a contact here who is in the provider manager role. Okay, so you can see that our contact here works for Contoso Hydro, and if we go to web roles, they're in the provider manager role. Now, by looking at the entity permissions associated with this role, we can see a few things here. So the provider manager has access to cases for their service provider. I've also got a couple of other permissions that I've associated here that I'm actually going to deassociate just for now, but I'm going to I'm going to draw your attention to them, that we could grant access to essentially all service areas for their service provider and then all service cases for their service area, which would sort of be another roundabout way of doing the same thing, right? Because if all cases are in a service area and I've got access to all service areas from my service provider, there shouldn't be any cases that are associated to any other service providers that I ought to have access to. So it should achieve the same thing. But instead of doing it that way, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grant access to the service cases for my service provider using account scope. So I'm just going to remove these. And now you can see that I just have access to cases for my service provider. Doesn't matter who they're associated to or what service area in, I'm going to have access to those cases. So on the portal here, I'm going to log in as the provider manager contact. And once I'm logged in and I go to service cases, so as you can see here, if I look at my service cases list, that I've got access to all the service cases for Contoso Hydro. And that is irregardless of what service area they're for, who the responsible contact is. So I have all service cases for my service provider. That's via that account scope entity permission record that's associated to the provider manager web role. Now note that we've got a few different examples here. For instance, I've got a specific service case here that neither has a responsible contact nor does it have a service area. So whether or not this is a valid scenario to have a service case that's not part of a service area or not, right? In this case, if there was a service case that wasn't associated with a specific area, I would be able to then rectify that and assign it to a service area and assign it to a responsible contact via this interface. And that's in addition to all of the service cases that have been routed to a service area or have been assigned to a responsible contact already. Another important point to make about entity permissions is that they also apply to custom functionality that has been produced with Liquid templates. Here I have on my portal a custom list of service cases, and this is using Liquid. And you'll notice that the list of service cases is exactly the same as the list of service cases that appeared on the service cases entity list, right? Because I'm applying the same set of permissions to both, and I don't have any kind of special filtering that's on one and not the other. Essentially, we're getting the same set of information from the system. It's just a list of all service cases in the system that's filtered appropriately by the entity permissions. So here in the portal management app, we can actually take a look at what this Liquid code that we're using looks like. So once again, in the portal management app, that's the app that we use to manage all of our portal stuff. And we can actually go to web templates. And I've created a template called list of service cases. So if I click into this template, you can see that it's a pretty straightforward template, right? We're just utilizing the entity view mechanism here. It's about as simple as it can get. So we just have entity view, and we specify the logical name of the entity that we're producing the list for, as well as the name of the view in the system that we're going to be utilizing in order to produce that list. And then for every list item, we just output some content, including its name, when it was created, and then I'm also printing out its privileges. And this is another kind of feature that I wanted to demonstrate, and that is that we can actually assert against privileges in our Liquid code, which makes it easier to test for testing purposes whether or not the logged in portal user actually has the privileges that you are thinking that they should have on the portal. So if I go back to my list of service cases, you can see for each case whether or not I have create, write, or delete privileges.